Hello and welcome to today's Institute for Government webinar. I'm Nick Davies, a Programme Director here at the IFG. Parliament has returned, ministers are back at their desks across Whitehall, and the summer holidays, if you had one that is, are already a distant memory. So what happens now? Well, that's what today's webinar is going to explore. In the first 2 months of this government, we've already seen a King's speech, a major statement on public finances, an overhaul of the planning system, big plans for clean power, and a summer knocked off course by riots across the country. And things are about to get even busier. So what legislation is coming down the track in Parliament? How significant is Rachel Reeves' upcoming budget? Will we get more clarity about what mission-led government actually means? How well did the government handle its awkward run-in over the civil service appointments? How is the Conservative Party leadership contest progressing? And how significant will the party conference season be? Joining me to discuss all this and more is a top IFG trio. Senior Fellow and former Government Advisor, Giles Wilkes, Senior Fellow, Jill Rutter, and Alex Thomas, who leads our Civil Service Work Programme. Please do send in your questions. We've got some fantastic ones landing already. But I'm going to start with a few of my own. Giles, I'm going to come to you first. What sort of start do you think the government's got off to?
Well, thanks, Nick. I would say if I was to choose one word, which is unnecessarily limiting myself, I would say the word tough. They came in with some quite tough messages, particularly about the fiscal inheritance, which we know that going to discuss more later. But they basically came in saying it's worse than we thought. We already were telling you that the previous government had made a huge mess of things. There's an even bigger black hole. That was one of the really key moments, coming in, ordering a quick audit and saying there's a £22 billion black hole, but also a tough response to the riots. I mean, milksop liberals like me are not used to the idea of cheering very quick and brutal prison sentences, but for when it's people pushing flaming wheelie bins at the police, we found a real enthusiasm for Keir Starmer channeling his internal director of public prosecutions and going after him really quickly. So, but I mean, in particular, there was also quite a tough and quick response on the planning system. They were saying, you told us we were going to be lacking in courage here, and we're going to go for it really quickly. We're going to rejoice in the fact that some people are squealing at us, moving quite quickly there. And they were also, I mean, on the positive side, they were quite decisive in trying to immediately nip off the idea of these public sector strikes with instantly large settlements for some of the striking workers, in particular in the NHS. I would say against that positivity, I would say beneath the surface somewhat, insiders have detected an indecisive and somewhat chaotic approach to appointments, both the sort of headline scandals, if you like, about appointing people who seem to be too close to Labour into sort of the non-political roles. So you're allowed to appoint party political people into special advisor roles, but putting them straight into the civil service raises quite a few eyebrows, and that's come across quite clumsily. But also, within the same category, a lot of the people that were expecting to move straight into government and were part of we were expecting here at the Institute, there's a well-prepared government entrance. There's a lot of people who've been prepared to move in and have been working through sympathetic think tanks. That's been much more halting and uncertain than we'd expected. So underneath those big initial messages, I'm not sure the appointments process has gone particularly well.
Alex, I might come to you next on that point. As Giles said, we've had some pretty bad headlines about appointments, and from the government perspective, not many headlines about missions. Is that something they should be concerned about, and is it something you've been concerned about watching?
Yeah, interesting. I mean, I suppose I'll take the missions stuff first, and then come on to the appointments. But also to say that I agree with Giles on the tough point. I didn't think I couldn't encapsulate it in quite the same way that he managed to. But one point I was going to make on the off, just as Charles has mentioned it, is there has been some criticism of the not enough hopey changey stuff and too much gloom and doom and toughness, and comparing that to the Kamala Harris campaign in the US, and can't we have a bit more optimism? One point I wanted to make, thinking about this in advance, is the difference between Harris and Starmer is that Harris hasn't been elected yet and Keir Starmer has. So Keir Starmer's got a very different objective here and a very different job to do. And I completely understand why they're playing that tough tune at the moment. We may get into more of that later. But on the missions and the appointments, I don't think it's a cause for concern that we haven't had lots of headlines around the missions. I mean, the government's been using them as their hook for various of the announcements, and I think actually the important thing about this phase of the missions is how they're organising themselves under the surface. So I'm not worried that the missions haven't been prominent enough, but I think there is a question over how far the civil service organisation has meshed with the political organisation around the design of these missions. And I think we won't really know that until we see what happens in the budget and we see what happens subsequently in the spending review, and how far departmental budgets are being managed through a missions prism, how far these mission boards that are being set up are actually kind of active and getting a kind of lock on the system. There have been some signs for that. Jill will have followed this more closely than I have, but Chris Stark, the sort of mission control head of the net zero mission, did start putting some stuff, interestingly, about reviews of the capacity on the grid and things like that. So if those things are being managed through the missions prism, then I think that is quite interesting. All that said, on the missions, I would fully expect there to be a bit of a refresh, a reset in a few months' time when they work out what's actually worked administratively, what hasn't worked, who is getting on with who isn't getting on with who. So I think we're likely to see an evolving thing around the missions. I would separate that slightly from the point about civil service appointments. We've been saying over recent weeks, this is a bit of a distraction. It's an unforced error. As Giles implied, to bring in political appointees, donors to yourself or your party through what's called quote unquote an exceptions process into core civil service appointments. While some of these people are perfectly good people who you might expect to get those jobs, the fact that they're politically aligned has raised questions and has diverted the government from some of the messages that it wants to put out. So we could get more into that. I don't think it's the sort of super vast scandal that some of the more kind of lurid commentary has been suggesting, but I do think it's been a distraction and it risks undermining the impartiality of the civil service. And we need a much better process so that ministers can bring in perfectly legitimately people they might want to be policy or political advisors, whether that's to explicitly political roles or to impartial civil service roles, but that we maintain a kind of clear break around the appointment on merit for the civil service.
Jill, I was going to come to you next. This has been mentioned that the government has been somewhat distracted in some cases by events such as the riots, which it couldn't control, and others such as the appointment scandal, which is self-imposed. But despite that, there have still been some big policy announcements, for example, on planning and energy especially. Have you been encouraged by those, and would you expect many more of those to come?
I think it's really interesting. Yes, I think those have actually sort of almost lived up to a degree of expectation. We saw that big planning announcement by Angela Rayner just before Parliament rose, and it does look as though the government is going to be quite bold on that. The issue, though, is, as a report that we published on Friday showed, lots and lots of governments have talked very boldly about imposing national targets. They've talked about building big numbers of housing. They've talked about not being deterred by the tricky local politics, but then they've been blown off course. And I think the real test of that planning announcement is not the first set of announcements Angela Rayner made. It's, can the government really show that this time it is sticking to the course? Because basically we've got a house building industry that is set up to build 150, 200,000 houses a year. So hugely short of the numbers the government now envisages. Now, it's not clear you can turn the tap on and magically have enough people to build, or the industry to build 300,000, 350,000, whatever you want, houses. That will only come if people think that that really is going to be a realistic, sustained number. If you like, the house building industry is optimized around a much lower level of house building at the expense of lots of other things for the economy, housing affordability, etc. So really interesting. Can the government this time stick the course? Does Angela Rayner stick around? Do we have a community secretary for once for whom housing is a priority? does the housing minister, sorry, Matthew Pennycook, but this may be blighting your promotion chances, does he actually stick around as housing minister for quite some time? Because, you know, the average life tenure of a housing minister is under a year. So I think very interesting on the housing front. So good start. Are you going to stick with it? On net zero, I think it really shows that Ed Miliband has effectively gone back to his old department. You know, he was the first Secretary of State for the Department of Energy and Climate Change. It may now be called the Department of Energy Security and Net Zero, but essentially it's exactly the same department as the one that he was used to running. And I think he's got off to a much quicker start, actually, than many of his colleagues in terms of being clear about his sort of mission structure. One of the things that I think is quite interesting, we were talking to Chris Stark, who's been brought in, former head of the Climate Change Committee, had left and gone off to run the Carbon Trust, but been brought in, not controversially, actually, interestingly, brought in to be head of mission control. He's actually mission control on, if you like, half that mission, because he's only mission control for the energy decarb part of it. And Lee McDonough, who's the DG Net Zero, is doing the other half of it, which I think is quite interesting there. Very clear that there's a very big job to be done. I think Parliament's debating this week the GB Energy Bill, the government's big vehicle for, if you like, de-risking some of the investment necessary into the energy sector. We've got an offshore wind auction coming up. Ed Miliband secured some more money for that. So there'll be fingers crossed that this one isn't a flop like the last offshore wind auction was. We had those immediate announcements about solar farms and rescinding the de facto ban on onshore wind. So I think they have really sort of, started to get into action. And they have requested the National Energy System operators, this is something we said they need to do, to produce a roadmap, which I think is due by the end of October, a roadmap for how do you actually deliver clean power by 2030. So lots going on, but it doesn't mean any of this is easy. The easy part is to announce some legislation and to make some announcements. The difficult part is to get this stuff procured, built. The UK is not the only country aiming to decarbonise its power sector. So there's a lot of competition going on for relatively scarce kit, expertise, etc. How do you do that in a cost-effective way? And it's quite easy to make some announcements in theory when you get lots of people. We all, I think, slightly pricked up our ears when the newly elected Green MP for Mid Suffolk was going on about how he had to be a constituency MP first in opposing pylons that were needed to bring offshore wind into the grid. And you sort of think, well, if even a Green MP has to put constituency first, maybe the politics of planning and the politics of clean energy are still pretty difficult.
You mentioned there that delivery is going to be hard in some cases, and probably the single biggest message the government's been trying to get across over the last couple of months is how difficult everything is because of the inheritance that it has received from the previous government. We had Keir Starmer recently in a short speech kind of summarising how dreadful the inheritance was, and we had Rachel Reeves in July setting out in some detail the state of public finances and the economic inheritance. Giles, do you think Labour is overdoing this? Is it as bad as they say it is?
You know what? I don't think it is overdoing it at all. In that when you work it out, the way I try to work it out, I mean, it's very difficult because, and the IFG does really good work through its Whitehall Performance Monitor and other things to try to work out, does the state have enough money to do the things that we all expect it to do? And how far out is it from having that amount of money? And there was a lot of speculation in the general election about neither side of the political divide being honest about this. The way I would see it, though, was for running departments, the government has 2 or 3 percentage points less of GDP to run the departments than George Osborne in 2015-16 thought was about the right amount after all that austerity. So this government somehow has to keep the same amount going on with extra promises and an aging society, extra promises like higher spending on defence, with less money going in and all of the sort of post-COVID reverberations to still deal with. So I do think the government faces a bit of a hole that even though the last spending review that Rishi Sunak as Chancellor kind of laid out did announce sort of rather large increases relative to what had gone before, it's still a really tight settlement for departments to deal with. And that's a really, really big problem. And a normal government with no political constraints would have been campaigning, I guess, on having higher taxes to fund this and say, look, we know that what the voters are worried about right now, which is really bad public services, we're worried about them. They're affecting health, they're affecting education, they're affecting the performance of the economy. And there's a gap between what we need and what we have. So I do think it's at least as difficult an inheritance as the coalition had in 2010. The coalition had to find, broadly speaking, £40 billion of difficult decisions, which they did through a big tax rise on VAT and some pretty difficult tax spending cuts. And I think we're having roughly a similar kind of thing that Rachel Reeves has to do, while everything feels a bit knackered and worn down, and the economy is growing much more weakly, even after a relatively good start to the year. So yeah, it is a tough inheritance, and I fully understand why they are maximising the gloom, because they want, in a year's time, when the voters have seen a lot of decisions that really annoy them, at the back of those voters' heads to be, I'm blaming the previous government, not this one.
Absolutely, and their message going into the next election as well. So our work found that on current spending plans, without a huge increase in public sector productivity, you're looking at public services performing worse at the next election in 2029 than they were in 2019, which was substantially worse than they were in 2010, which is not a particularly strong re-elect us message. So they're going to have to make some very difficult decisions in the budget coming up on 30th of October. Alex, there have been reports of the Treasury asking departments already to find big savings ahead of that. What can you give us an idea of kind of what are the discussions going on within Whitehall at the moment about where those difficult decisions are going to fall and where potential cuts are going to fall?
Yeah, a big old bum fight in a sense, and they happen at a number of different levels. So I suppose to start at the bottom, there are decisions within departments. They know what's coming. The Treasury will have set out various kind of parameters and scenarios they want them to model and say, what would you do in X, Y, and Z scenario? Often it's a sort of a 5% cut, a 10% cut, a 20% cut. And so departments will have been working through those as part of their submissions into the budget, and that involves quite a lot of departmental game playing sometimes, dread to think, but putting up cuts that are politically unacceptable, or things that are kind of a minister might care less about, but they know that number 10 or the Treasury cares a lot about. And so there's a bit of shilly-shallying around that. But in the end, there are sort of the fundamental decisions about how you would save the money happening at a departmental level. What departments also might do, heaven forbid, Ministry of Defence mentioning no names, is put some stuff out into the public domain, talking about how difficult it will be if certain cuts are made. I should say the MOD is not the only offender on that, but there is a whole kind of, I'm trying to avoid saying army, but of former military types who are very willing to go on the record about how damaging it is, for all that actually, personally, I think we should be spending more on defence, but let's put that to one side. But then you get into the kind of machinations inside the Treasury, and often you talk about the spreadsheets, the lists that chancellors have when they go through the ledger, the tax rises, the potential tax cuts, and then the other ways of raising more money, and set that against the spending commitments that departments are putting in. So there is this sort of kind of whirl of technocratic process, but that it involves a whole world of bureaucratic and political game playing. But in the end, it comes down, as often as not, to the Chancellor and the Prime Minister hashing things out. What does this really mean for us? What do we want to do? Do we want to have a surprise in the budget? Are we willing to take the pain here or there, and to do that through a series of bilateral meetings? And I say that because it feels like we're in a phase where the Chancellor and the Prime Minister are getting on reasonably well together and are having a constructive relationship and setting strategy for the whole government. That has obviously not always been the case with previous chancellors. So that kind of Starmer-Reeves relationship and how it evolves over the course of this budget and then the spending review that follows will be really interesting. One final quick point, because it goes to, I think, what Giles was saying is, and slightly the kind of doom and gloom versus optimism. I think that's slightly the wrong framing for this budget and subsequently. It's not are we giving reason for hope and optimism versus everything is awful and inheritance. There was a really interesting interview with Tony Blair and by Andrew Rawnsley, I think, in the Observer or the Guardian over the weekend. And Blair's framing, which I found quite compelling, was it's about governments doing stuff, and this is where the planning things that Jill was talking about earlier come in. So I think it's less about, are you sending out optimistic or pessimistic vibes? It's, are you laying the groundwork now to in this budget to do the things that you need to achieve by the end of the parliamentary term. The other interesting little facet around the budget process is we've got party conferences in between. So do ministers feel compelled in their party conference speeches to make spending commitments that might drive the Treasury wild? So that's the other wild card that might come out between now and the budget.
Jill, I wanted to come to you on some of the kind of the political, overarching political strategy. So obviously Labour committed in the campaign not to raise income tax, national insurance or VAT, which means if you've got difficult spending decisions, you've either got to raise more substantially or a lot of other smaller taxes, or you've got to make cuts elsewhere. And one of the kind of unpopular things that's already been announced earlier in the summer was the move to restrict winter fuel allowance. First, I mean, do you think that particular measure will stick? But do you also think the kind of strategy of where to take the political pain is right? Will it be less damaging to make lots of small unpopular decisions rather than to reverse those commitments that were made in the general election campaign?
I think they really have boxed themselves in quite badly on the big taxes, the sort of significant revenue raises. And lots of people are saying that given the lack of political credit that the Conservatives got for their national insurance cuts, which really quite a lot of money, around 20 billion in total, it would have been much easier if those hadn't happened. But Labour went along with them, said they weren't going to be any part of anything that put extra taxes on working people. So they really are quite boxed in on the tax side. I mean, you say that the winter fuel allowance means testing would be unpopular. It wouldn't be unpopular with Treasury officials, for whom this would be on a list of easy things to do that probably gets served up to every minister who comes into the Treasury. Quite interesting to listen to people like, the very political chancellors who now have a podcast together, political chancellor and shadow chancellor Ed Balls and George Osborne, who I think are sort of rather surprised that Rachel Reeves took that off the Treasury. These are quite easy ways to raise money. I think what was particularly interesting about that was the decision to announce that then as a sort of almost a symbol of, I'm really prepared to think the unthinkable and do difficult things, as opposed to hold it and put in the wider context of the budget. You could argue logistically people need to start planning their sort of winter fuel, and it would have been too late to do it on the budget. Budget's on my birthday, by the way, so that's something to look forward to.
What a present.
Ways than one. So I think it's really quite a sort of interesting move. And I think one of the things Alex was talking about, the Rachel Reeves, Keir Starmer relationship, I think this is going to prove a very early test of that relationship. Because if Rachel Reeves can make this stick and show that this actually is part of a sort of brave and different approach to reshaping public spending, etc., and can see through the politics of it, and Labour can come through the other side, then I think Keir Starmer will probably be prepared to do what he seems pretty prepared to do at the moment, which is leave most of this to Rachel Reeves. I'm not myself at all convinced that Keir Starmer's interested in economic policy per se, but Giles and Alex may have views on that. I think if this blows up and Labour is forced into a really difficult retreat, and we've seen retreats on these sorts of measures before, where effectively you give away almost all of what you were trying to save by a series of sticking plaster measures. So you stick with your headline measure, but you end up doing lots and lots of other things, which basically mean it really wasn't worth the political flack you've got for it. Then I think number 10 may feel that they really do need to keep much closer watch over what the Treasury is doing. They won't assume that just because Rachel Reeves thinks this will work, it will work, and you will start to get that sort of, second guessing that drives the Treasury mad for number 10, but also that tension that you get when number 10 doesn't think the Treasury is warning it enough in advance of some of the consequences of some of the measures they're taking. So I think how that winter fuel allowance row plays out is going to be quite interesting to see how that partnership works. It may be that Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer both had their hands absolutely in the blood, and Keir Starmer may even have said, look, Rachel, all my friends, my barrister friends are all getting this allowance. They all think it's a waste of money. Surely we can get rid of that. And she went, oh yeah, well, okay, let's do that, Keir. And that's all fine. But if it was just Rachel Reeves reading down the Treasury list, the sort of list that also gave you the pasty tax, static caravans, etc., all those things that are perfectly sensible tax changes to have made, then I think we might see the number 10 Treasury relationship getting a bit tenser. And actually it is the sort of normal state of affairs for that relationship to be quite a tense relationship. And actually that's usually quite constructive, because it does mean there's someone there saying, are you really sure? Is that really a good idea? And it was the lack of challenge from David Cameron, I think, that partly led to the omnishambles budget back in 2012.
Giles, I want to come to you for one more question before I take some of the audience questions that we're getting. You mentioned that growth now is less impressive than it was in 2010 and indeed than in 1997. And obviously with low growth, that makes all of these trade-offs much harder to make. Do you think the new government has a kind of realistic plan for getting growth growing?
Not yet. I mean, and you've set the bar incredibly high, because remember, we've got a £3 trillion economy. A big decision in the budget is a couple of billion here or there. The idea that a ship that large can be motored up that quickly is very fanciful, when most economists would say it's really big structural forces that get in our way. I would say it's got a better attitude towards some of the key levers, like maybe more openness and cooperation with Europe, a more institutionalist attitude to economic policy making that might provide more certainty, an aspiration to let's hope a focused industrial strategy where they focus their efforts where they can really make a difference. These are all useful enough things, but that decline in the growth rate that has been, I mean, when we came in the coalition, they were assuming 3% growth for the next few years, and that made the fiscal numbers look very easy. Now, like 1.5 or 2, these are really big differences. So you can't expect them over August to come up with a plan for growth that would change that, and they don't have something accessible like the Blair Brown team did with making the Bank of England independent, and at a stroke removing the thing that had caused the biggest headache for chancellors for 30 years. That sort of a play just isn't open to them. So no, they don't have one yet. I would say the jury is out whether they're going about it correctly. Just announcing new ideas like a growth mission board, I really want to see whether the relationship between the Treasury and the Business Department and the rest of government is going to be exactly the same as it's been for the last 20 years before deciding whether they've got a good chance of fixing that one.
Great. I'm going to go to some questions from the audience. We've got some great ones in already, so please do keep submitting them. So the first one, Jill, I might put this one to you. So this is from Anthony Valiant, and he's asked, what role do you think parliamentary select committees will play with the large Labour majority, and when will they be set up?
So I think we'll probably get them. I never know why it takes so long, but I'm told by our excellent director that who's a former parliamentary clerk, that it does. So they'll probably really kick in around November. We've got this short period now. We've got some people expressing interest in running. Controversially, some Labour newly elected people are seeing some of their number being made ministers and deciding that they'll have a go at being select committee chairs, which doesn't seem to be going down desperately well with some of their more experienced colleagues, let's put it that way. So we'll see. I think it's really interesting, how do they adapt into the scrutiny role? Because select committees are really effective when they are skillful enough at getting some degree of cross-party consensus and agreement on some area where the select committee wants to push the government. But actually that means that select committees are usually a bit better at answering the question, has the government done what it said, rather than is the government doing the right thing? When you're looking at is the government doing the right thing, it's quite difficult, because that's really the subject of political debate. the government said it would do X, but X isn't happening, is something where it's actually much easier for MPs on a cross-party basis to say, well, why aren't you doing this? Why haven't you addressed this and stuff like that? So I think they'll really kick in probably in a year or two's time. I think will be quite interesting to see who takes over. The Conservative will now get the Public Accounts Committee, which is always a very, very powerful committee in Parliament. We're very used to seeing, Margaret Hodge, Meg Hillier, these people being omnipresent on our radios in the morning. I think it'd be very interesting to see who goes for that from the Conservatives, because they'll become effectively a really big figure in the opposition. But the Conservative candidates are a bit complicated by so many of them currently running for leader and that timing. So I think probably November-ish, but I don't expect we'd be seeing huge amounts out of select committees until probably actually around this time next year. But Alex, and Giles, having been on the wrong end of scrutiny, may have a different view on how quickly we'll expect to see anything really concrete coming out.
The right end of scrutiny, Jill, obviously, the welcome and always useful contributions. I think the only thing I'd add to that quickly I would expect us to see the chairs being elected a bit sooner than that. So they will, maybe over the course of this month, they will start to kind of coalesce media commentary, parliamentary analysis, and so on. So I think the election of the chairs will be interesting. Also about what it shows about the balance of different powers and factions within the Labour and Conservative Party, and so I think we'll see stuff coming out and things. So, for example, on the civil service appointment stuff, you would expect to see whoever is the chair of the Constitutional and Public Administration Select Committee being asked questions about that, and that kind of playing out in that less kind of weighty tones report kind of style, but as part of the public debate.
Giles, I just want to come to you because now, because the Lib Dems won so many seats at the election, they now get to chair a few of the committees, including the Environment Committee and the Health Committee. And I just wondered, how are the kind of some of the more senior Lib Dem MPs going to be thinking about this? Is that going to be a better kind of opportunity for profile chairing those committees than being a potential frontbencher for the party?
I think 15 years ago, you'd have thought no, and the best thing ever was a ministerial car. We all remember what happened about 9 years ago to having a ministerial car and what that then did to the next election. So I imagine if the Lib Dems' goal strategically is to remain a really big force in government, in Parliament rather, from like 60 to 100 seats, then I agree with you. I think in particular, those two committees, they strike at topics they really love campaigning on, health and social care. In particular, but also DEFRA is going to be the sort of the flooding and the sewage thing. So I think it provides them a perfect opportunity to be a critical friend of the government, having a go at them and making sure that, if anything is delivered in those two areas, they can say, look, it was our pressure that kept it on. So I think they're sitting quite pretty, so long as they don't suddenly become addicted to the thought of having ministerial cars again.
I'm going to move on to the next question, and Jill, I might come to you on this first, but I'd be interested in the views of others as well. They've asked, party conferences coming, Labour's first, then the Conservatives. What does success look like for each of the parties, and what will you be looking out for?
Okay, well, I'm a complete party conference addict. I think it's because of most of my career I wasn't allowed to go as a civil servant, so I love them to bits. So I think Labour will be, partly it will be sort of just pleased with itself. Last year, Labour was incredibly sort of jittery and incredibly controlled because that was all part of, your Ming vases going everywhere, that they obviously saw the Labour Party conference as something they had to get through with no clangers. I think people will be looking to see, how good is Keir Starmer? How good are these ministers making speeches from the conference floor? Do they use them to do what they haven't really done so far, which is actually to set the sort of individual bitty announcements that we've seen into a broader context of, where is actually this going to take us? So what can I look forward to be, if I'm an activist, to be saying to people in 4 years' time when I go back to them and seek a renewed mandate? So can they really energise their Are there bubbling signs of discontent? We might come on to this, but is Keir Starmer coming under pressure from the membership on things like the EU? Is anyone at all in Labour interested in PR? Some of those sorts of things where we know that the membership's in a different position to the leadership of the party. So I think that'll be really, really interesting. In Labour, the Conservatives, I mean, really interesting question. Does anyone sit in the conference hall for Rishi Sunak's speech as leader? Do they even bother to schedule Rishi Sunak's speech as leader? Or do we just, it's going to be entirely dominated by the four fighting it out for the leadership? So,
Giles, what will you be looking out for anything in particular?
Well, in particular, on a topic that we touched on earlier, it's all very well doing the gloom thing in Downing Street when you're talking to an audience of not just the people who were there in the Rose Garden, but he's trying to send the message to Whitehall that things are going to be really tough. In the conference hall, he surely can't be doing the doom and gloom. You don't go to conference except in the moments of the absolute worst emergency to deliver tough messages that's all going to be absolutely awful. Surely that's the opportunity at which his strategists try to come up with something a bit more sort of hopeful and joyful. So I'm going to be really interested in that, whether Starmer can do hope and joy, because we can see he can do Eeyore. Can he do Tigger? Because all of the agendas, I mean, 14 years of pent-up policy ambition, all the things that those people there will want to see starting to be delivered. They don't want to be told just, oh, by the way, it's really, really hard. What a mess the Tories left behind. They need more than that.
Alex, I'm going to take a new question for you. Someone's asked, given the quick reactions to stopping public sector strikes and starting planning reform, what's the next sticky issue that the government will tackle? They've said, is social care reform going to be on the horizon anytime soon? I might quickly answer that social care one, just because it's slightly weird. It was floated at the beginning of the summer, the idea that there would be a royal commission of some sort on it. It's something that the Liberal Democrats are pushing for as well, but it has since gone very, very quiet indeed, and there was nothing in it on it in the King's speech. So I think we'll have to wait and see on that one, though the DHSE are currently undertaking a number of reviews on the state of their inheritance of the health and care system. Alex, I know you used to work in that department. What's the advice they're going to be giving ministers on social care?
Oh yeah, a brief time in Department of Health, so I don't want to overclaim my credentials, but I suspect they will be saying what I would agree with, which is if you're going to do something, you need to do it now. So I heard slight alarm bells around talk of a royal commission or something something akin to that, because this is the time in this phase of the Parliament to grasp that nettle. So it will be very interesting to see what they say, and they will be they'll be putting forward the various different models from kind of Dilnot onwards that have been proposed, and trying to kind of match the logic and reality of the position with the politics. But we're not under reviewed or under analysed in social care world. You know more about this, Nick, than I do. But so the problem to me seems it's not the kind of thinking about it. It's how you match the necessary realities with the politics and are prepared to take the political hit. More broadly on sticky issues, I think, the more I think about the importance of planning to this government, the bigger it seems. So I do think planning is an enormous issue, and yes, they've made, as the questioner says, they've made a quick start on aspects of that, but can they continue that? They've got a better shot than the last Conservative government did, just because of the makeup of their political support and their backbenchers, although more Labour backbenchers are now in kind of greener, leafier areas of the country. But they should have, they've got the political win there, but both for house building and for all the infrastructure stuff that we touched on around net zero, but lots of other areas as well. Planning does seem, and the kind of Blair mantra of do stuff, planning seems to be the thing that comes back. I suspect other things that are coming up around rail nationalisation won't cause too many political headaches, at least in the short term. So that will kind of roll on in terms of the legislation. On the question about public sector strikes and public sector and wage settlements, pay settlements, I am quite sympathetic. I'm not sure they had much choice if they wanted to deliver the agenda and to show some progress on waiting lists and so on, that they needed to make these settlements quickly, early doors. But the sticky thing on that side will be, do they have a medium to long-term strategy about their relationship with the public sector workforce? How are their relationships with the trade unions going to play out? How do they avoid the kind of ratchet that the unions perfectly legitimately will be arguing for on behalf of their members, while kind of maintaining some constraint and control on that? The other thing, this would have been my answer to what to watch out for at the Labour Party conference under the surface, that I think could get sticky, is this sort of central control versus devolution and decentralization. When you've got a government that does want to do things and will want to set targets and momentum from the centre, that's partly what the mission boards are about. Are they managing to reconcile that with what they've committed to do on decentralization and devolution of power, and what their activists and members are looking for as well? So I think there's an interesting potential fault line in the sort of how of government around devolution and decentralization. And so I think that could get a little bit sticky over the course of the coming probably years rather than months.
Jill, I'd be interested in your thoughts on that. Kind of, are they going to devolve, and if so, where to? Is it going to be kind of more powers for combined authorities, or kind of filling the gaps in areas that aren't currently served by a combined authority, or are they going to be more interested in additional powers for local authorities?
Not clear, I think, what they'll do. I think they'll want to try and do both, a sort of deepening and a widening, because if you sort of, they've said in their planning reforms that they want to see, by the end of the Parliament, universal coverage of more strategic planning. And the area where there's real lack of strategic planning sticks out is the sort of more rural areas, particularly you've got sort of smaller, lower level councils, not very much capacity doing planning. So I think it's really interesting, but there's always going to be a tension fighting out. And here it's going to be really, really interesting to see where the Treasury is positioned. We really only got significant progress on devolution to the combined authorities when it came from George Osborne's big push out of the Treasury, before all previous attempts run primarily out of the Community and Local Government Department, whatever it's called at the time, had sort of run into the fact that Whitehall departments didn't want to give up power. One of the really difficult things is you've got lots of new ministers who've just come in. The sort of appetite for saying, well, I will take myself out of that and give those powers away, is really quite a difficult ask. The other thing is that where you're going to say we're going to be judged on our delivery of those missions, you actually probably want to sort of retain quite a lot of control about what that looks like, because you don't effectively, this is a point that a very, very senior former Labour minister made to me at last year's Labour Party conference, said, there are limits to how far this devolution thing can go, Jill, because, if you're going to be judged by this, you really don't want to be completely dependent on Andy Burnham, Steve Rotherham, Ben Houchen for what happens. You want to be able to sort of take the actions and point to those successes yourself. So we'll see how this plays out. We are promised what they're still calling their Taking Back Control bill, which should be the sort of giving away power bill. Not supposed to be taking it back to at all. Maybe that's a bit of a mentality shift. But we'll see what that actually has in terms of substance. And the really interesting thing is, down the line, dare they touch anything to do with local government finance? Rachel Reeves did at one point have ambitious plans to reform business rates, but I think they've gone pretty silent on that. Looks at Giles to see whether I've just missed something. And although absolutely every sort of think tank in the country is screaming at them about how ridiculous council tax it is, how out of date, etc., and how it needs to be reformed, there are 9 million reform proposals from every economic commentator out there on how to do council tax less badly than it is now, there doesn't seem any significant appetite for that at all. So it's quite difficult to see how you do much more tax devolution at the moment. And I think that's really quite interesting. If you're going to give loads more powers, do you want to actually make local government more responsible for the taxes they raise. It's really difficult to do without some underlying reforms the way in which we finance local government. Offering myself for a policy review there, but my track record of having been involved with the poll tax probably rules me out.
Giles, I want to come to you on the next one. There's a question from Josiah Mortimer from Byline Times, who's asked, looks like the rail renationalisation bill is being pushed through very rapidly with the final Commons stages this Tuesday. What do you think this government's approach to parliamentary scrutiny of legislation will be?
Oh, wow. Look, it's not my expert area. And on rail renationalisation, I thought there's going to be plenty of time to scrutinise things as they come along, because it's a process of the contracts running out and then being taken back on by the government. I think shifting from a franchise model to a concession model is what the insiders say it's going to be. But as for the government's attitude to scrutiny, well, you know, I mean, it's got nothing to fear, has it? It's got a 170-seat majority, and it knows that legislation is improved by scrutiny. So I don't see why it should necessarily be rushing and trying to evade it here. I don't think if they are to evade scrutiny, I don't see why necessarily the rail renationalisation bill would be where I'd start. So I would just say we need to calm down at the beginning. I was there at the beginning of the coalition. The first few weeks are always slightly chaotic and charged, and everyone rushing around and making a drama out of everything. I don't think now's the time to try to make a grand conclusion on something so important.
I just quickly, Nick, on that, just to add, it's a point we've made before, but I do think I agree with everything Charles said on the sort of let's not rush to conclusions, and to emphasise it is really, you know, this is 2 months in, and one of those months was August, so it is still really, really, really early, and we can kind of look at the King's speech and a few other points, but not a lot else so far. But one of the things I think they have shown, and we heard a lot about this before the election, that they are going to be prepared to use the secondary powers that the last government and predecessor governments have left them. So I don't think, I think it will probably depend, as it often does, on the attitude of individual ministers about how far they embrace parliamentary scrutiny and you know, consider concessions on legislation and things like that. But I think you know, they have made a tactical policy decision that they're willing to use secondary legislative powers where they exist, and so I would expect to see those used, which is a bit of a salutary reflection on previous governments of all colours about how those kind of have accreted onto the statute book. Similarly, you can be a bit too po-faced about this. I think governments do need to get stuff done, and you know, in the end, they're judged their record at the election. So scrutiny is really important, but it comes back to that thing I said about Blair earlier. You know, crack on with it and get things done, and then be judged on your record.
Jill.
Okay, I'm going to be a bit more po-faced because I do think that they need to slightly watch this rhetoric action gap. That it's fine to assert, you know, we're different, we obey the rules, we take this seriously. And I think this is where you've seen Keir Starmer be rather flat-footed over these cronyism allegations in the last couple of weeks, as well as the unforced errors that Alex was talking about earlier. It's not enough just to assert we're different from the last sleazy bunch that didn't do this, didn't believe in Parliament and things like that. You actually do have to sort of live up to that. And if you want to say, you know, we're going to be different in the way in which we treat Parliament or whatever, then you actually, you know, can't just say it. You actually have to do it as well. And as Giles said, you recognise that actually it's quite useful sometime to find out what sort of opposition your legislation's going to run into and hear suggestions for improving it and potentially react to those. So it's not a bad thing. And the government should be pretty well guaranteed that it can get stuff onto the statute book. It doesn't have to worry about those sorts of ambushes with that majority unless it manages to mishandle its parliamentary majority on a spectacular scale. And
just to say, I do agree with all of that, and I would not equate your sleaze with using the secondary legislative powers that you have available to you. So let's not conflate those two. But clearly, you know, scrutiny is important and it improves legislation.
Alex, you mentioned Tony Blair, and one of the things that he was asked about in his interview, and that he's been a huge advocate of in recent years, has been AI. And we have a question from Jenny Tennyson, who's asked, do the panel think the public and public sector workers are bought into the government's plans around technology and AI in public services?
Gosh, there is enthusiasm and interest in it, and I think there are some really interesting, innovative kind of pockets, as so often on areas like this, pockets of government, obviously centered around DSIT, but also people who've worked in number 10 and around the center and the use of data. But I don't have a sense, government is a behemoth on things like this, and I don't have a kind of clear sense of the strategy that the government is using to build in to get buy-in across the whole of the public sector workforce. I know, for my part, the civil service is interested in how technology can be applied in policy making and in how you kind of consult with people and draw in different views. Interesting, the kind of Peter Carl moves to put the government digital service into Department of Science, Innovation and Technology and to kind of coalesce around that. I remain a tiny bit kind of cautious around DSIT as a department. What levers does it really have? It helps that the government digital service has gone in, but how much authority does it really have to crack the whip on technology across government and across the whole of the public sector? So I might be doing a disservice here, and Giles wants to come in and will know more, but I sort of dread to say it a bit, but it does feel like a bit of an area in need of a coherent strategy that DSIT is then kind of able to deploy across government. But Giles will give a better answer than that.
Well, I mean, actually, I was going to come in and acknowledge that I think Jenny, who asked the question from the Open Data Institute, I believe, and might have put out a really good, I think it was a 10-point thread on Twitter recently, setting out the conditions you need to win that trust from public sector workers, which I'm now annoyed I didn't memorize and repeat back here. But I think, you do need to win that trust. It's clearly important. I would say at the outset, the framing fact we should all be bearing in mind, there's a lot of skepticism about whether AI is going to be as transformative as some of the stock market valuations suggest it should be. The one area that even the skeptics agree with is that the business of administration and public sector administration in particular is one of the real great areas of potential. Anything about chewing up paper and turning it around into clear decisions and making that happen more quickly, whether, like going through consultations or just generating responses to documents, that does seem to be what large language models are for. So we should be seeing this as an opportunity. I do hope that the obstacle isn't public sector worker trust. I don't like the framing that seems to imply this is all about like stealing the work from the workers, because when it's administration is a pure dead weight, and public sector workers should be wanting to spend their times on the stuff that you need human beings for. And so I do hope that we get those trust conditions right, but there is a gigantic opportunity there. We have a lot of text data that could go through large language models and could become more efficient. And we should be trying to work out how, not whether, this happens.
Just to add my 2 pennies worth, I mean, I think when we speak to people who are on the front line, be that in hospitals, schools, local government, they are interested in what this can offer, but they also say, look, we are facing some much more basic technological issues. Our Wi-Fi is patchy. We have old computers that take 30 minutes to load up. Some of us are still using Windows software from 20 years ago. And actually there's some like critical plumbing issues that need to be resolved, not least the kind of quality and connectedness of the data across the public sector if they're going to make best use of AI in the future. Jill, I want to come to you with potentially 2 related questions. So firstly, is an outdoor smoking ban a good use of political capital? And what's the opportunity cost of not addressing some wicked problems? And then I think relatedly, how can Labour meet commitments to reduce waiting times when the Chancellor has asked DHSC to find 1.3 billion in savings ahead of the budget?
Okay, well, I'm going to throw the waiting times question back at you since you write all this stuff about public services, Nick. But on the outdoor smoking ban, we did an interesting study about the way in which actually consensus developed very quickly about the indoor smoking ban. Is it something that I would have inordinately prioritised? I mean, there is quite a lot that says, you know, that denormalization of smoking is actually quite a good thing to do, that, you know, you sort of actually basically create a society in which it's an odd thing to do, but insofar as that basically means people smoking about the worst place for them and their families, which is at home, I'm not sure it is a sort of great thing to do if that's the alternative. I intensely dislike being anywhere near people smoking, but I'm slightly annoyed if there's someone at the next table in the garden in a pub smoking, but it's not the world's most annoying thing. So I'm not sure I'd have expended that, but I'm not sure it takes huge amounts of political capital actually to get rid of it. So we will see where that comes. I don't think that was something that sort of leaked out, but the government does seem determined to revive Rishi Sunak's tobacco and vapes bill. And I think they're actually really quite interesting question marks about the wisdom of their smoke-free generation thing, which lots and lots of people in public health seem very signed up to, but I would have thought is where the battle really ought to be, the discussions there about how wise is that, or do we just let the market develop away from smoking, which actually is what we're doing pretty effectively at the moment. On waiting lists, clearly there's some stuff you could be done with better management, but we seem to be cutting managers. And more investment, more capacity, and clearly settling the doctors' strikes will help stop the problem getting worse. But Nick, you have 1 minute to solve waiting times now.
Look, I can see why some people are skeptical about the value of putting more money into the NHS. It's had quite a lot of extra money in the last few years, and it hasn't led to a step change in activity in hospitals. But that is because, Jill, as you said, we've underinvested in some of the kind of critical enablers of productivity. We've cut managers, which means we're not very good at allocating money within the system. Where we do have analysts, they tend to be in the centre of government rather than where they need to be at the front line in trusts. We have historically underinvested in capital. So versus other kind of wealthy nations, we have far less equipment like scanners, and the hospital estate is in a dreadful position with, you know, literally floods of sewage stopping procedures from going ahead. And also since 2010, we have focused all the money on acute services even more than previously, and cut back on some of the kind of preventative and wider health and care services that could take the pressure off hospitals and allow them to meet those waiting times. So I think, you know, in the long term, maybe you could meet those waiting time goals with spending less. But in the short term, with most trusts running deficits, that's just not going to happen, particularly given the underinvestment in all those areas. And on that note, I'm going to bring the webinar to a close as we have run out of time. So many thanks to Jill, Alex and Giles, to everyone who watched at home, and to all of those who sent in such fantastic questions. And I'm really sorry for those that we didn't get time to ask. You can watch this webinar back anytime. It's on our website, and the audio will be up and running on our IFG events podcast feed in a few hours. We have lots of fantastic IFG events in the calendar, so check out our website and sign up to watch. And that includes a webinar on Thursday to launch our Ministers Database with information on every government minister in the UK since Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister. You can find all the roles and individuals held, all the different people that have done one particular role, and much more. So join us on Thursday for a discussion on what the database tells us, how we put it together, and why it's important to know which minister does what in government. Hopefully see you then. Goodbye.